Her own father put her on a wagon and sent her to a stranger's ranch, not because he believed in her, because he wanted her gone. She was not the daughter in the photograph. She was not the name in the contract. She was the one nobody planned for, nobody asked for, and nobody expected to last a single week on that hard Texas land. But here is what her father did not count on. The woman he threw away was the only one brave enough to tell the truth. And the man who thought he wanted someone else was about to discover that what he actually needed had just stepped off a train with one bag and no intention of leaving. Stay with me. Because this story is not about being chosen first. It is about being strong enough to become someone worth choosing. Welcome to Velvet Red Lies, where every story we tell lives in the dust and wind of the American frontier. Cowboys and consequences. Love earned the hard way. The bonds between mothers and children. Strangers who become family, and broken people who find their way back to each other. If that is the kind of story that moves you, you are exactly where you belong. You were never the wrong person. You were just waiting for someone brave enough to see you clearly. If this story touched something real in you, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this reaches. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. I will be here every week with a new story worth staying for.
I have been shoeing horses since I was 11 years old. My father taught me the way he taught me everything, by doing it himself, until I understood that watching was the same as learning, and that asking questions was the same as admitting you had not been paying attention. By the time I was 14, I could shoe a horse faster than most grown men in Caldwell County. By the time I was 20, I had stopped thinking about it at all. The work lived in my hands the way breathing lives in the chest. Automatic, reliable. Something you only notice when it stops. I was in the middle of it that October morning, crouched in the dirt of my own barn with a bay gelding's left foreleg across my knee, when I heard Walt Pruitt's mare coming down the ridge road at a pace that meant news. Walt had been my foreman for 9 years. I had learned to read the sound of his riding the way I read weather, the angle of approach, the speed, what he chose to do with his horse when his mind was occupied. A slow trot meant he was thinking. A canter meant something needed doing. The pace I heard now, hard and direct from the direction of Redemption Creek, meant something had gone sideways. I set the gelding's leg down and straightened up. Walt came through the barn door, still half-mounted, one boot on the ground before the mare had fully stopped. He was 52 years old, and had the face of a man who had spent every one of those years outdoors. He did not waste words on normal days. He wasted even fewer on days like this one. He said, "The woman from St. The woman." Louis came in on the morning train. I waited. She is not who Harlan Ashfield said she was. I pulled off my work gloves, one finger at a time. What do you mean she is not who he said she was? I mean she is not the woman in the photograph. Walt took his hat off and turned it in his hands. She gave her name as Ashfield. Her papers say Ashfield. But she is not the woman in that photograph, Garrett. Not by a considerable distance. I had looked at that photograph so many times in the past 6 months that I could have described it in the dark. Vivien Ashfield, golden-haired, pale-skinned, the kind of face that made men in St. Louis drawing rooms forget the names of their wives. The matchmaker had sent the photograph along with a letter describing her capabilities. Capable household manager raised in a prosperous family, eager to build something lasting in the Western Territories. I had not chosen her for the photograph. I wanted to be clear about that, at least to myself. I had chosen the arrangement because I was 34 years old, and Coles Ridge needed more than one person to run it. And hiring another hand cost money I was already short on. A wife made practical sense. That was the entirety of my reasoning. At least that is what I told myself. How different, I said. Walt put his hat back on. Different enough that I noticed from across the platform. I hung my work gloves on the nail by the barn door and went to get my horse. Redemption Creek sat 6 miles west of Coles Ridge on the only road that connected this part of the hill country to the rest of Texas civilization, such as it was. It had a church, a saloon, a boarding house run by a widow named Clara Dunn, a general store, a courthouse made of cedar planks, and a sheriff's office that was currently occupied by a deputy named Rex Malone, because the county sheriff lived in Kerrville and only came through once a month. It was a town of 300 people who knew each other's business with the thoroughness of people who had very little else to occupy their attention. I rode in with Walt beside me and nodded at the people I passed the way I always did. Pastor Hugh Mercer sweeping the church steps, his white hair bright in the October sun. 2 of the Hadley brothers loading feed sacks outside the general store. Deputy Malone leaning against the jail post with his arms crossed and his eyes moving across the street the way they always were, tracking everything, settling on nothing. Malone nodded at me. I nodded back. Something about the way he was positioned, angled slightly toward the train platform, weight forward, registered in the back of my mind and did not leave. I found her on the platform. She was standing alone with one cloth bag at her feet, and she was looking at the town the way someone looks at a card game they have not been invited to join yet. Quietly, carefully, learning the rules before committing to anything. She was not beautiful in the way the photograph was beautiful. She was something harder to name. Dark hair pinned back in a braid that had come partly undone from the journey. A brown traveling dress that had seen better days. She was not tall. She was not, by any conventional measure, what I had been expecting. When I stopped in front of her, she looked up and met my eyes without flinching. I had expected tears, maybe, or nerves, or the particular performance of cheerfulness that people deploy when they are frightened. She had none of that. She just looked at me, direct and steady, and waited. I said, "You are not Vivien Ashfield." She said, "No." I said, "The contract specified." She said, "The contract specified an Ashfield daughter. I am an Ashfield daughter. What it did not specify was which one." She said it without apology and without performance. Just the plain fact of it, laid out on the table for inspection. Walt coughed behind me. I stood there on that train platform in the October sun, looking at a woman I did not know who had traveled from St. Louis, Missouri to Redemption Creek, Texas, on a contract that had been arranged for someone else. And I made the first of many decisions about Nora Ashfield that I did not fully understand at the time. I said, "Come on then, come on." She picked up her bag without a word and followed me to the horses. The ride out to Coles Ridge took 40 minutes. I gave her my horse and walked mine alongside. She sat the saddle like someone who had ridden before, but not recently. Competent enough not to fall. Cautious enough to tell me she was not comfortable. I did not offer conversation. She did not ask for it. What she did, for 40 minutes, was look at the land. The hill country in October is not a gentle landscape. The limestone ridges catch the light hard. The junipers are dark green against pale rock. The sky is enormous in the way that Texas skies are enormous. Not dramatic, just factual. The kind of wide that makes a person feel both small and strangely relieved. I had lived in it for 9 years, and I still felt it sometimes. That combination of smallness and relief. She looked at it the way I had looked at it the first time I came through. Not with disappointment, not with wonder, but with something closer to recognition. As if the hard landscape made sense to her in a way that softer things had not. I noticed that. I filed it away. Coles Ridge came into view from the crest of the last rise. The main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the corral where 3 horses were standing in the afternoon shade. 2,000 acres of hill country that I had bought 9 years ago with borrowed money and had spent every day since paying off with the work of my hands. It was not a pretty place. It was a working place. There is a difference. I showed her to the spare room upstairs. Narrow bed, wooden chair, window that looked east over the limestone slope. I laid out the rules the same way I would explain them to a new hand. Meals at 6, noon and 6 again, water pump behind the kitchen, outhouse past the barn, lamps out by 10. She listened, nodded once at each item, did not ask questions. I left her there and went back to the gelding I had been shoeing. That night, lying in my own bed with the hill country quiet outside and the unfamiliar sound of another person's presence in my house, I thought about what Walt had said on the platform. Not who he said she was. No, she was not. I did not yet know what she was. But I had spent 9 years learning to read land and horses and weather, and I had learned that the things worth understanding rarely announce themselves plainly at first. I gave it a week. That was the deal I made with myself. I would give it a week. The first thing she did the next morning was find the supply inventory. I came in from the early feeding to get coffee and found the kitchen empty, the coffee already made, and Nora Ashfield nowhere in sight. I found her 20 minutes later in the storeroom off the back of the kitchen, sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor with every tin and sack organized around her in groups I did not immediately understand. She looked up when I filled the doorway. "Your flour and your cornmeal are being stored together," she said. "The moisture from the cornmeal is getting into the flour. You have been losing about a third of each sack before it is used." I looked at the organized tins. "I have been doing it that way for 9 years." "I know," she said. "I can tell from the staining on the shelf boards." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her dress. "I moved them. The flour is on the dry side now, and the cornmeal is near the door where the air circulates better. You will notice a difference within a week." She walked past me into the kitchen and refilled her coffee. I stood in the storeroom doorway for a moment looking at the reorganized shelves. Then I went and got my coffee. The first week unfolded in a pattern I had not planned for. I assigned her tasks I considered fair measures. Reorganize the supply inventory, which she had already done before I asked. Repair the kitchen garden fence, which she completed in one afternoon using wire and cedar stakes she found in the barn without asking where to look. Tend to an old mare named Bessie, who had a wound on her left foreleg that required daily cleaning and fresh wrapping. Bessie was particular. She had put Walt on the ground twice during wound care, and bitten a ranch hand named Charlie, hard enough to leave marks. She stood quiet for Nora from the first day, dropping her nose to the woman's shoulder while Nora worked, patient as a dog. I watched that from the corral fence and said nothing. On the 4th day, I came in from the north pasture in the early afternoon and found Nora at the kitchen table with my ranch ledgers spread open around her. 2 years of accounts, the columns I had kept in my own handwriting, laid out across the pine surface. I stopped in the doorway. She looked up, not guilty, just direct, the way she always was. "You have been overcharged for feed grain since the spring of 1877, she said. "Whoever sold it to you adjusted the weight measurements on the receipts. The recorded weights do not match the standard sack sizes. You have lost somewhere between $40 and $60 depending on how far back it goes." I walked to the table and looked at what she had marked. Column by column, neat pencil notations in the margins of my own handwriting. She was right. I could see it clearly the moment she showed me where to look. I felt something I did not enjoy feeling, the particular discomfort of a man who has been shown a hole in his own floor that he has been stepping around for 2 years without seeing it. I was not a stupid man. I kept careful records. I had simply never been shown the pattern from outside. I did not thank her. But I did not tell her to stay out of my books either. That evening, Walt pulled me aside near the barn. He had his arms crossed, and the expression he wore when he had made up his mind about something and was deciding how much of it to share. He said, "She is sharp, that one." I said, "I noticed." He said, "Sharp women in quiet circumstances are either a blessing or a complication. I have not decided which yet." I said, "Give her time." Walt said, "That is what I am afraid of." He uncrossed his arms. "She asked me this morning where the fencing tools were kept, not which tools, where they were kept. She already knew what she needed. I looked at the barn. Walt said, "I'm just telling you what I observed." He went back to his work. I went back to mine. The following Sunday, I took Nora to church. This was not optional in Redemption Creek. Absence from Sunday service was noticed and interpreted, and I was not in a position to have the town interpreting anything about my new situation without correct information. I told Nora this plainly on Saturday evening. She said she understood and asked what time we needed to leave. Pastor Hugh Mercer was 63 years old and had been the moral center of Redemption Creek for longer than most of its current residents had been alive. He had a white beard and hands that looked like they had done real work in addition to holy work, and eyes that went directly to the truth of a situation without making a production of it. He shook Nora's hand after service and held it a moment longer than greeting required, the way a man does when he is taking a measurement. He said, "We are glad to have you in Redemption Creek, Miss Ashfield." She said, "Mrs. Cole, or Nora, whichever is more comfortable." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Nora, then." The congregation absorbed her the way small communities absorb newcomers, with the thoroughness of people who have very little else to occupy their attention. The women assessed her dress, her posture, the condition of her hands. The men looked at me with questions in their eyes that I answered with a nod that meant not now and not here. Clara Dunn sat 3 pews back and watched Nora with an expression that was not curiosity. I had known Clara Dunn for 9 years. She ran the boarding house and she kept her own counsel, and she had the memory of a woman who had paid close attention to a great many things over a long time. What she wore on her face watching Nora cross the churchyard was not curiosity. It was recognition. I stored that away next to the thing about Malone on the platform. On the ride back to Coles Ridge, Nora was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone with nothing to say. The settled quiet of someone who has been measuring something and reached a conclusion. I did not ask what the conclusion was. That evening I came outside to find her on the porch steps reading a worn Bible by the last of the October daylight. I almost went back inside. Instead, I sat on the step above her. After a silence, I said, "Most people read inside." Without looking up, she said, "Inside feels like I am borrowing something that is not mine yet. Out here, I am just sitting on steps." I did not have an answer for that, so I sat there until it was too dark to read, and then we both went in. I lay awake longer than I should have that night, turning that sentence over. Not because it was a remarkable thing to say, because it was the most honest thing anyone had said in my house in 3 years. 3 weeks into October, the nights turned cold enough to see breath, and the heifer in the north pasture chose the coldest night of the month to go into difficult labor. Walt was down with a bad knee from a fall he had taken repairing the east fence line. The 2 ranch hands were in the bunkhouse, and I did not want to wake them if I could manage it alone. I pulled on my boots and coat in the dark and went out with a lantern. I found Nora already there. She had heard the heifer from her window, a sound that takes experience to identify as distress rather than ordinary nighttime noise. She was crouched in the dirt of the north pasture in her coat with her own lantern, her hands already checking the animal with the methodical calm of someone running through a mental checklist. She looked up when I came through the gate. "She has been at this for a while," she said. "The calf is positioned wrong." I crouched beside her. "How do you know that?" "I grew up watching our family's horses. Wrong position sounds different from slow progress." I looked at her. In the lantern light, she was matter-of-fact and competent and completely unconcerned with whether I found her presence here unexpected. She had heard an animal in trouble and she had come. That was the whole of it. We worked through the night side by side. She followed my lead without being told to. When I needed a second pair of hands, she was already moving. When I needed her to hold the lantern at a particular angle, she read the situation before I spoke. When the calf finally dropped alive into the cold dirt just before dawn, she sat back on her heels and let out a breath that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but somewhere between the two. We sat against the stall wall in the dirty hay with our backs against the cedar planks and our legs stretched out, and watched the calf find its legs in the gray first light. I was tired in the particular clean way of a person who has spent all night on something that mattered and come out the right side of it. I had not felt that kind of tired in years. The other kind, the tired of routine work with no particular outcome, I knew well. This was different. After a long while, I said, "Why did you come here?" Not the answer you would give a stranger. She was quiet long enough that I thought she would not answer. Then she said, "I chose to get on that wagon. Nobody put me on it." I said, Your father arranged." She said, "My father arranged for Vivien to come. I arranged for myself. I waited for the rest of it." She looked at the calf standing on uncertain legs in the pale morning light and said, "That is all you get tonight. Not coy, final. Like a door that had been opened 1 inch and stopped there deliberately. I did not push, but I did not let it go either. She had chosen this. A woman who did not know me, had never seen my land, had every reason to stay in whatever life she was leaving, had chosen to climb onto a wagon headed into the Texas hills. There were exactly two explanations for that kind of choosing. Either she was running towards something, or she was running away from something bad enough that a stranger's ranch in the hill country looked like a reasonable destination. Neither answer made me comfortable. Both answers made me want to know more. We went back to the house as the sun came up, said nothing about the night to Walt when he came in for breakfast, and went about the day's work. That evening I told Walt what she had said on the way back from the barn. He listened with his coffee cup in both hands and his eyes on the middle distance. Then he said, "Harlan Ashfield. I have been trying to place where I know that name from, and it is not from a marriage contract." I said, "What do you mean?" He opened his mouth to answer. From the direction of the front gate, a single gunshot cut through the dark. We were both on our feet before the sound finished. We found it at first light after a sleepless night of watching. A bullet hole in the cedar post of the front gate. Wrapped around the post with a length of wire, a piece of paper torn from a ledger. The writing was careful and educated. It said, "Send her back, last warning." I put it in my coat pocket. I told Walt to say nothing to the hands and nothing to Nora. Then I rode into Redemption Creek to report it to Deputy Malone. Malone rode out to Coles Ridge within the hour. He was a methodical man with a broad face and pale eyes that moved constantly without appearing to. He examined the gate post, examined the ground around it, asked me several questions about the previous evening. Then he walked a slow perimeter around the front of the property, looking at things in a way I could not quite categorize. He spent more time looking at the main house and the barn, and the distances between the outbuildings than he spent looking at the gate post where the shot had hit. He was not investigating a crime scene. He was measuring the property. I did not say this out loud. I filed it alongside the other things I was filing. When Malone rode out, I went back to the house and found the note on the kitchen table. Nora was sitting across from it with her hands around a coffee cup, looking at it the way she had looked at my ledgers, with the focus of someone extracting information. I said, "That was in my coat pocket." She said, "I know, I found it when I was hanging your coat." She looked up at me. The phrasing. Send her back, not send her home. Whoever wrote this does not think of where I came from as home for me either. She had read more into it in 10 minutes than I had in an hour. I sat down across from her. She said, "Someone sent it. Someone paid to send it. That means someone in St. Louis knows I am here and wants me gone. And the only people in St. Louis who know I am here are my father and my sister." I said, "We need to talk about what you are not telling me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, small and certain. "Yes, we do. But not today. Today I need you to tell me something first." I looked at her. She said, "The way you live in this house. Like a man who lost something and rearranged everything so he would never have to look at the space where it used to be. There is something you are not telling me either." The kitchen was very quiet. I said, If I tell you, will you tell me why you got on that wagon? She said, yes. So I told her about Ellen. Her name was Ellen Marsh when I married her in the spring of 1873. She was 22, from a family in San Antonio with pretensions toward Eastern refinement that had not quite survived the move to Texas. She was beautiful in a way that photographs capture well, which is to say the beauty was in the surfaces, and the surfaces were considerable. I had been 30 years old and building something, and I thought what I needed to build the rest of it was a partner. That was the word I used to myself. Partner. As if I were entering a business arrangement rather than a marriage. Maybe that was the problem. I never did fully work that out. Ellen came to Coles Ridge in June of 1873, and by December of that year, she had stopped pretending to like it. By the following spring, she had stopped pretending entirely. She found the work ugly. She found the isolation suffocating. She found me. And I am giving you the plain version of words that were considerably less plain when they were spoken, insufficient for the life she believed she deserved. I could have argued. I did not. I did not know how to argue about a thing like that. It did not seem like something you could win. In March of 1876, a traveling merchant named Douglas Hale came through Redemption Creek, heading north toward Abilene. He had a nice horse and a quick smile and money that came from somewhere I never investigated. He stayed 3 days at Clara Dunn's boarding house. On the third morning, Ellen packed one bag. I noticed later that she had taken the one bag, the traveling bag, the bag with the good leather handle. And she was gone before I came in from the early feeding. She left a letter on the kitchen table. I read it once, then I burned it in the stove. I rode into Redemption Creek that afternoon and told Pastor Mercer that Ellen had died of fever. 3 days, nothing anyone could do. Mercer held my hand and said the words that people say, and I stood there receiving them and felt nothing except a cold and specific shame that had nothing to do with grief. I had told that story so many times in the 3 years since that it had started to feel true to me. The particular expression of a man who has lost his wife to fever, the downward look, the silence that follows. I had gotten very good at it. I told Nora all of it. Flat, plain, no performance. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. She said, "Why are you telling me this now?" I said, "Because I am about to ask you something, and I cannot ask it while standing on a lie." She waited. I said, "The threat on that paper is real. The only thing that makes it meaningless is if this arrangement looks permanent and genuine to anyone watching from the outside. That means a real marriage. Church, witnesses, the whole of Redemption Creek present." I looked at her across the table. "I am asking if you are willing, with the understanding that I am asking for a real reason, not a strategic one." She studied me for a long moment. Then she said, "Before I answer that, you have told me your real thing. Now I will tell you mine." And she told me why she had gotten on the wagon. The night before the wagon left St. Louis, Nora could not sleep. She went downstairs for water at 2 in the morning and heard her father and her sister in the study. The door was not fully closed. She stood in the dark hallway and listened. The plan was this. Vivien would travel to Texas, present herself as the contracted bride, marry Garrett Cole in good faith as far as anyone could observe. She would be cooperative, convincing, and patient. After 6 months, long enough for the marriage to appear settled and real to outside eyes, she would manufacture grounds for abandonment. She would leave Redemption Creek and return to St. Louis, and the marriage would dissolve. With the marriage dissolved, Harlan Ashfield would activate a land debt instrument he held against Coles Ridge, a mortgage on the property that had never been properly cleared, held through a company name Nora did not recognize, and take the land through legal foreclosure. Garrett Cole would lose his ranch, legally, with no recourse and no warning. Vivien had agreed to this. She had sat in that study with their father and agreed to travel to Texas and destroy a man she had never met, in service of a financial strategy she had no real stake in, because refusing Harlan Ashfield had consequences that Vivien had long ago decided were not worth facing. Nora had stood in the dark hallway and understood two things simultaneously. The first was that a man she had never met was about to be ruined by her family. The second was that she was standing in a hallway in her father's house at 2 in the morning because she could not sleep in her own room. And she had not been able to fully sleep in 3 years. And the reason was that every morning she woke up in that house, she faced another day of being Henry Harlan Ashfield's second daughter, which meant she was a person who existed by tolerance rather than by right. She went back upstairs. She packed one bag, the one with the worn leather handle that she had carried since she was 16. In the morning when the wagon came, she walked out the front door before Vivien came downstairs. She said, "I did not know you. I had never seen this place. But I knew what was being planned for you, and I could not unknow it. And I had one bag packed and a wagon at the door, so I got on." The kitchen was very quiet again. I said, "You gave up your life in St. Louis." She said, "My life in St. Louis was a room in my father's house, and a seat at his table that I occupied by tolerance. There was not much to give up." I looked at her across the pine table with the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and the sound of Cole's Ridge working outside, and I thought about Ellen leaving with one bag. I thought about Nora arriving with one bag. I thought about the particular expression Nora had worn looking at the hill country land from the back of my horse. Not disappointment, not wonder, but recognition. I said, "Will you marry me? In front of the town, for a real reason?" She said, "Yes, on one condition." I waited. She said, "We tell Pastor Mercer the truth about Ellen before the ceremony. He deserves to marry us with honest information." I said, "That will be through the whole town within a day." She said, "I know. Is that a problem?" It should have been. I said, "No. That evening, I rode to Pastor Mercer's house at dusk with the weight of a secret I had carried for 3 years and set it down on his porch in plain language. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening hill country. Then he said, "It takes more courage to tell the truth late than to have told it early. Both are better than never." He looked at me. "Bring her Sunday after next." I rode home in the dark, feeling lighter than I had in 3 years. It was not a comfortable feeling. Lightness, when you have been carrying something long enough, feels strange and exposed. But I did not pick the weight back up. The women of Redemption Creek organized around the wedding with the particular efficiency of a community that does not get celebrations often. Clara Dunn contributed fabric from a bolt she had been saving. The Mercer sisters, Pastor Hugh's daughters-in-law, both of them capable women with strong opinions about everything, showed up at Cole's Ridge on a Tuesday with a basket of food and took over the kitchen for the afternoon. Nora was absorbed into it with the matter-of-fact warmth of women who have decided a thing is worth doing properly. I watched this from the barn doorway. She did not perform warmth in return. She just had it plainly, without decoration. Thanking people with the specific gratitude of someone who does not take small things for granted, asking questions about the town and its people with genuine interest, laughing once at something Clara Dunn said in a way that was quick and real and briefly transformed her face. I went back to my work. Walt found me in the feed room that afternoon with his arms crossed and the expression he wore when he had information he had been sitting on long enough to feel uncomfortable. He said, "I remembered where I know the name Harlan Ashfield." I set down the feed scoop. He said, "2 years ago I was passing through San Antonio on ranch business. I was in a lawyer's office waiting for a clerk to find some papers. The lawyer was in conversation with another man in the inner office and the door was not fully closed. I was not trying to listen." He paused. "The name Ashfield came up in connection with land debt in the Texas Hill counties. Not development, not ranching. Debt accumulation, buying old mortgage instruments through intermediary companies and holding them as leverage." I said, "Leverage for what?" Walt said, "That was not the part I heard clearly, but the word they used was foreclosure." He looked at me. Coles Ridge had a mortgage on it when you bought it, Garrett. You paid it. But did you personally verify who held the original note at the time of sale? I said, the man I bought from handled all of it. Walt said nothing, which was its own answer. I said she told me about a mortgage instrument her father holds, a company name she did not recognize. Walt said, if the original note was not properly cleared, if Ashfield purchased it before the sale and the discharge was recorded, but the note itself was never surrendered, he could claim the debt is still active. I stood in the feed room with that information and felt the particular cold of a man who has been standing on what he thought was solid ground and has just heard it hollow beneath his foot. Walt said, after the wedding, Garrett. Handle it after the wedding. But then handle it. I said, yes. 2 nights before the ceremony, I found Nora on the porch after supper, sitting with her knees drawn up and her eyes on the dark hill country. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and the stars were the hard, brilliant kind you only get when the air is completely clear. She had been deciding something all day. I had felt it in the slight distraction behind her eyes at meals, the particular quality of her silences. I sat down beside her. After a while, she said, there is more that I did not tell you. I waited. She said, I told you I overheard my father and Vivien planning what they intended for your ranch. I told you I got on the wagon to stop it and to leave. She paused. What I did not tell you is that Vivien is not simply ambitious. She was not doing it freely. She told me what she had heard in the hallway that night, the full version, not the summary she had given me before. Vivien's agreement, yes, but also the thing underneath the agreement. The arrangement Harlan had made as a contingency. A man named Arthur Pennick in New Orleans, 60 years old. 3 previous wives under circumstances that the St. Louis legal community apparently preferred not to examine too closely. If Vivien did not cooperate with Texas, that arrangement would be activated. Nora said, she is not a good person. But she is not simply a bad one. She is a person who has been making deals with a dangerous man for a very long time and has run out of options she can live with. I said, does that change what she was going to do to this ranch? She said, no. But it changes what I think about her, which is not the same thing. I looked at the stars. She said, I wanted you to know before we stood in front of Pastor Mercer, all of it. I said, why? She said, because you told me about Ellen when you did not have to. It would be a poor trade if I did not. The night was very quiet. I said, the whole thing, the note, the plan, your sister, all of it. We deal with it together after Sunday. She said, together. That one word, the way she said it, not as a question and not as a condition, but as a simple restatement of fact, did something to the cold place in my chest that had been there since March of 1876. The wedding was on a Sunday morning in the second week of November. Redemption Creek turned out in full. I stood at the front of the church in my good shirt with Walt beside me and watched Nora come down the aisle on her own, which she had decided on herself and which I found when I saw it exactly right. She wore a dress the Mercer sisters had helped her alter. Dark blue, simple, nothing that did not belong to her. She looked at me the whole way down. Pastor Mercer knew the truth about Ellen. He had known it for 2 weeks, and he had not said a word to anyone, which was the kind of man he was. He performed the ceremony with the weight of someone who understood what he was presiding over. Not a transaction, not a performance, but an actual beginning. I said my vows looking directly at her. She said hers looking directly back. When it was done and we walked out into the November sun, the town of Redemption Creek made the sounds that small towns make when something has gone right for someone they have decided to approve of. Clara Dunn touched Nora's arm. Pastor Mercer shook my hand and held it. Walt said very quietly in my ear, "Good." That was all he said. From Walt, in that context, it was a great deal. I thought about Ellen's letter burning in the kitchen stove 3 years ago. I thought about Nora standing at the end of that church aisle, looking at me the whole way, I thought, this is the first thing I have done in 3 years that feels entirely like myself. November gave way to December, and December brought the particular cold of the Texas Hill Country at its worst. Not the killing cold of the northern plains, but a damp, penetrating cold that found the gaps in your coat and stayed there. The work intensified the way it always does in winter. Water troughs needed breaking before first light. Cattle needed supplemental feed hauled to the north and west pastures. Fence line checks happened twice a day because cold weather was hard on cedar posts and wire both. Nora worked alongside without being asked to, without being directed to, and without complaint. She took the organization and the records. I took the physical weight. Neither of us had assigned these roles. We had simply found them the way water finds the easiest path, without discussion, without drama, because it was the natural shape of two people whose capabilities happened to fit together. Walt watched this with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already calculated. 3 weeks into December, a cattle buyer from Kerrville rode out to look at my yearling stock. His name was Beaumont, and he was the kind of large, confident man who fills space deliberately, who conducts negotiations as if the other party is a secondary consideration. He dismounted and shook my hand and then turned to conduct the entire conversation with me, prices, weights, delivery schedule, as if Nora were not standing 3 feet away with the inventory sheets she had prepared. I caught her eye. She gave me the smallest head shake, a movement no one else in that yard would have noticed. Don't. I looked at the fence line. Nora stepped forward with her papers. She said, "The weights are recorded here. Current market price in San Antonio as of last week is documented here. Our floor price is here. I will need your counter-offer in writing before you leave." Beaumont blinked. He looked at me. I examined the middle distance with great interest. Beaumont looked at Nora's papers, looked at Nora, looked at his boots, and then engaged. It took 20 minutes. When he rode out, he had paid $12 more than I would have accepted. Nora put the signed paper in the ledger and went back to the kitchen. I followed her. I said, "I could have stepped in at any point." She said, "I know. Thank you for not doing it." $12, and something I did not have a name for yet. The storm hit the 3rd week of December, a blue norther rolling in fast from the northwest, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in 6 hours. The barn roof had a weak section I had been meaning to reinforce since October. The wind found it. Nora and I repaired it in the dark by lantern light, working in driving sleet that came at a horizontal angle and found every gap in coat and collar. The cedar shakes were heavy with water, and the wind made the work twice as difficult as it should have been. At one point, Nora slipped on the wet ladder. I caught her arm. We both knew I could let go now. We were stable. The moment for catching her had passed. I did not let go. She looked at me in the lantern light with sleet on her face and said nothing. I said nothing. Then we both went back to the roof. I thought about those 10 seconds longer than a sensible man should have. 2 nights before Christmas, with Walt gone to his sister's place in Fredericksburg, Nora and I sat by the fireplace after supper. I was repairing a bridle. She was writing a letter. I asked who she was writing to. She said her mother's sister in Kansas, the only member of her family who had written to her after she left St. Louis, the only one who had asked if she was safe. She told me about her mother then, dead when Nora was 14. Fever. And there was a moment where she said the word, and we both heard the other word it sat next to. And she looked at me with something that was not pity, but was in the neighborhood of understanding. I said what I had not said to anyone, that Ellen leaving had not been the worst part. The worst part was what I had found in the house after she was gone, or rather, what I had not found. Evidence of myself. Some mark of who I was, some proof that I had lived in the place I had built. Ellen had filled it with her preferences and her unhappiness, and when she took both away, what remained was pure function. A working ranch with no one living in it. I said, "That is what I have been afraid of. Not that you would leave, that I would find out again that there is nothing here worth staying for." The fire crackled. Outside, the hill country was cold and still. Nora set down her letter. She said, "Garrett." Ellen left because of who Ellen was. That is not a mystery that reflects on you. She wanted something you were never going to be able to give her because it is not in the nature of this land or this work. You did not fail her. You were simply not what she wanted. Those are different things. I did not fully believe her, but I believe she believed it. That night, that was enough. Walt returned after the new year with a manner that had shifted in some particular way I recognized. He had made up his mind about something. He found Nora in the chicken yard and stood there, hat in hand, for a moment before he spoke. He said, "I had you wrong." She said, "I know." He said, "I was watching for the angle. There is not one." She said, "There was. I just played it before I got here." Walt said, "Getting on the wagon." She said, "Getting on the wagon." He nodded, put his hat back on, went back to his work. That was the whole of it. For Walt, it was the equivalent of a speech. We found them on a Monday morning in the second week of January. 12 head of cattle dead in the west pasture. Not sick. Dead overnight, clustered around the secondary water trough near the limestone draw. No signs of predator attack. The water in the trough had a smell that did not belong to water. I crouched at the trough edge and felt the cold certainty of a man looking at something that did not happen by accident. Only certain people knew this land well enough in the dark to find that specific trough. The one that was not visible from the road, that was fed by a spring that only showed on hand-drawn maps of the property. My hands knew it, Walt knew it, and someone who had been watching Cole's Ridge long enough to learn it. I rode into Redemption Creek and reported the loss to Deputy Malone. He rode out within the hour, examined the trough, examined the cattle, asked several questions that were reasonable questions for a lawman to ask about poisoned water. Then he walked a slow perimeter of the west pasture, looking at the main house in the distance, looking at the barn, measuring the space between things with his eyes. He asked me how far the western boundary ran from the main road. He asked when I typically took my hands into town for supply runs. He asked whether the deed to Cole's Ridge was held at the county courthouse or a registry in Austin. He was not investigating a crime. He was appraising the property. I thanked him for his time and watched him ride back toward town. Then I went to find Nora. She was not in the house. She was not in the barn. Walt found her at the Redemption Creek Courthouse records room. She had ridden in alone while I was with Malone, which told me she had known what she was going to find and had wanted to find it without an audience. She came back to Cole's Ridge in the early afternoon with a leather folder of copied documents under her arm. She spread them on the kitchen table. The Cole's Ridge mortgage instrument was recorded in the county land records, dated 1870, 4 years before I purchased the property. The original lender was a ranching family that had defaulted. The instrument had been purchased by a company called Ashfield Land and Trade, St. Louis, Missouri. A discharge document was in the file. Someone had recorded it at the time of the sale. But the original promissory note, the one that would prove the debt had been paid, the one that would physically transfer the obligation and its cancellation, was not in the file. Without the original note, the discharge could be challenged. A man with the right lawyer could argue that the debt had been recorded as discharged in error, that the underlying obligation remained active, that the holder of the original note was still owed. Nora said, "My father holds the original note. That is the instrument he was going to activate after Vivien left." I stood at the kitchen table and looked at the copied documents and felt the hollow sound underfoot again, louder now. I said, "How do we find a piece of paper we cannot produce?" She said, "That is not the only piece of paper in this." She looked at me. "Malone. He has been here since before we married. He knew exactly which water trough to send someone to. He has been on this property multiple times. He asked you questions today that a man investigating poisoned cattle has no reason to ask." She was right. I had known it and not said it out loud. She said, "I want to talk to Clara Dunn." I drove her into Redemption Creek the next morning. Clara Dunn's boarding house was the kind of place that accumulated information the way a river bend accumulates silt. passively, inevitably, because of the particular shape of the thing. People passed through. They talked. They left papers behind sometimes, or letters, or things they said to each other in rooms with thin walls under the impression that the landlady was occupied elsewhere. Clara was never occupied elsewhere. When Nora showed her the copied documents and explained what we had found, Clara set down her coffee cup very carefully on the kitchen table of the boarding house. Then she went to the back room. She was gone for several minutes. She came back with a locked tin box. Inside were letters, written on Ashfield land and trade stationery, addressed to Rex Malone at a post office box in San Antonio, going back 2 years before Malone had applied for the deputy position in Redemption Creek. The hiring arrangement was clear, monthly payments documented, instructions explicit. Malone's assignment: establish himself as law enforcement in the target county, observe Coles Ridge and its owner, report on the financial position of the ranch and its debt structure, and when the time came, smooth the legal process of foreclosure from the inside. Clara said, "A courier came through 18 months ago, one of Ashfield's men. He was drunk the second night and he left his satchel in the common room. I looked. I kept what seemed worth keeping." Nora said, "Why, I?" Clara said, "Because I have been in this town for 20 years and I have seen what happens when someone with money decides to take something from someone without it. I thought someday someone might need these." She looked at Nora steadily. "Looks like today is that day." I took the letters. I spent one day deciding how to use them. The county sheriff was 2 towns away and came through once a month. A federal marshal was the right instrument, but a marshal required a formal request and took time to arrive. Malone could be gone in that time, and with him any chance of connecting him to Harlan Ashfield in a way a court would accept. What I had was evidence. What I needed was witnesses. I went to Pastor Mercer. I laid everything on his desk: the letters, the land documents, Nora's account of what she had overheard in St. Louis, Walt's testimony about what he had heard in San Antonio. Mercer read everything twice. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There is a federal circuit marshal coming through the county seat in 3 days. I can send a rider tonight with a written request and the document copies. He will come." I said, "Malone cannot know." Mercer said, "Malone will not know." That left the question of the immediate confrontation, because Malone was still wearing a badge in Redemption Creek and still had access to Coles Ridge, and the water trough was not going to be the last instrument he used. I went to the saloon at the end of the working day, when Malone would be there the way he always was at that hour, and when enough of the men of Redemption Creek would be present to serve as witnesses to whatever happened next. I put the letters on the bar. Malone read the room in the particular way of a man who has been caught and is calculating the cost of the remaining options. His hand went to his gun. Walt, who had been sitting in a corner table for 40 minutes, which was not a coincidence, shot the gun from Malone's hand before it cleared the holster. One clean shot. No one killed. In the silence that followed, Pastor Mercer stepped in from the doorway with the authority of a man who has been the moral center of a community for 30 years. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "This man is disarmed. Someone get a rope. The circuit marshal will be here in 3 days." Nobody moved to help Malone. Riding home that evening, Nora said, "Malone was the instrument. My father is the hand." I said, "He will come himself when he hears." She said, "I know." A pause. "Are you afraid of what he will do?" I said, "Afraid of what he will try to do. Yes, afraid of him succeeding." I looked at her. "No." She said, "Good." Then she said, "Neither am I." The hill country was dark around us and cold and enormous. I thought, whatever comes next, she will not flinch from it. I thought, I would not want to face it with anyone else. She arrived in a private coach on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after Malone's arrest. I was in the barn when Walt came to the door and said, "Company coming up the road, nice horses." I came out and watched the coach come up the long drive from the road. The driver was hired. The woman inside stepped down with the careful grace of someone who has practiced being looked at. And she was exactly as the photograph had shown her. Golden-haired, pale-skinned, wearing traveling clothes that cost more than a month's feed for the whole ranch. Vivien Ashfield stood in my yard and looked at Coles Ridge with assessing eyes. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at Nora, who had come to stand beside me. Something moved across Vivien's face that she controlled quickly. I had spent enough time watching land and horses to know when something real was being covered over. She said, "Mr. Cole, I hope I'm not arriving at a difficult moment." I said, "That depends on why you are here." "Why?" She said she was here to discuss a misunderstanding. She said she had brought a lawyer from San Antonio for the purpose of a civil conversation. She asked if we might meet at the church. Neutral ground, she said. Pastor Mercer agreed to the meeting. The community turned out because in Redemption Creek a public meeting at the church is a civic event, and word had gotten around. Vivien performed well. She always had, I suspected. She told a version of events in which Nora had acted impulsively, taken something that was not hers to take, embarrassed the family and dishonored a contract. She used the word stolen twice. Her eyes filled at exactly the right moment. Whitmore, her San Antonio lawyer, supported the narrative with professional efficiency. I watched the room. Some people were moved. The women who had helped with the wedding, who had sat with Nora through the December cold, who had seen her work, they were not moved. Nora waited until Vivien finished. Then she put the land documents on the table. She said, "Before we discuss the marriage contract, can you explain to this room why our father holds an unresolved mortgage instrument on my husband's land through a company called Ashfield Land and Trade in an amount that was supposed to have been discharged at the time of purchase?" Vivien's composure did not break, but it bent. I stepped forward, not in front of Nora beside her, and addressed Whitmore. I said, "I believe this conversation requires a federal marshal and a proper court, not a church meeting. The marshal is already coming on a separate matter. We will combine the proceedings." Whitmore began to argue procedure. Pastor Mercer said, "I think that is the right approach." Nobody in the room disagreed with Pastor Mercer. Vivien found Nora in the churchyard afterward, away from the crowd. I watched from a distance, close enough to see, not close enough to hear. I had learned by then when Nora needed presence and when she needed space, and this was space. What I observed was this. Vivien arrived at the conversation with armor on, and Nora received her without armor. Whatever passed between them happened in 3 or 4 minutes of standing still in the November sun. Vivien spoke for most of it. At the end, Nora said something brief that I could not lip-read, and Vivien's face did something it had not done in my presence. It went from calculated to unguarded in the space of a breath. When Nora came back to me, she did not offer details. She said, "She is coming back tonight, alone." I said, "What for?" She said, "I think she has decided something." Vivien arrived after dark on a hired horse, no coach, no maid. She knocked at the kitchen door like a person who was not certain of her welcome. I answered it, looked at her, let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, all 3 of us, with the fire going and the hill country dark outside. Vivien put a leather satchel on the table. She said, "These are my father's real financial records, not the ones he shows to banks." She opened the satchel. Harlan Ashfield was insolvent, had been for 14 months. The debt he owed to a Philadelphia banking house and 2 private investors in Chicago could not be paid from anything he currently held. Coles Ridge, through the mortgage instrument, was the single asset he could liquidate in time to prevent complete financial collapse. This had never been about Vivien marrying anyone. It had never been about the contract. It was a land seizure, dressed in the language of a family arrangement, because a legal foreclosure requires a triggering event, and a deceptive foreclosure is harder to prosecute if the parties involved appear to be operating in good faith. Garrett said, "Why are you giving this to us?" Vivien looked at her hands on the table. She said, "He told me last week that the Pennick arrangement in New Orleans is finalized regardless of what happens in Texas. The wedding date is set for April." She looked at Nora. She said, "You got out. I helped him corner you, and you got out anyway. The least I can do is make sure he does not take what you found on the way out." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Nora said, "What will you do after?" Vivien said, "I do not know. I have not had to answer that question honestly before." Nora said, "Then that is a good place to start." Vivien left Coles Ridge an hour later. She rode south toward the Kerrville Road. I watched her go from the porch. Nora came to stand beside me. I said, "Do you believe her?" She said, "Yes, not because she is a good person, because she is a person who has finally run out of deals she can live with, and that is its own kind of honesty." We stood there in the cold for a while. I said, "Your father will come himself when Malone's situation reaches him." She said, "I know." I said, The marshal will be here before him if the timing holds." She said, "And if it does not?" I said, "Then we deal with what arrives." She nodded. We went inside. The federal marshal arrived on a Thursday. His name was Briggs, a lean, unhurried man from Austin who read documents carefully and asked questions in a flat voice that gave away nothing. He reviewed everything: the letters connecting Malone to Ashfield land and trade, the land records, Nora's account of what she had overheard in St. Louis, Walt's testimony about the San Antonio conversation, Vivien's financial documents. When he finished reading, he said, "I will need to see Mr. Ashfield." Harlan Ashfield arrived in Redemption Creek the following Monday. He came by private coach with two men who were not ranch hands. He wore a gray suit and a confident expression, and he shook hands with the ease of a man who has never entered a room he expected to lose. He was 60 years old and silver-haired, and he had the particular charm of men who have spent a lifetime making people feel that whatever he wanted was also in their interest. I had been warned about this charm. I had told myself I was prepared for it. Standing in the yard of Coles Ridge watching him step down from his coach, I understood why warning does not fully prepare you. Charm at that level is not a quality. It is a skill developed over decades, and it operates on instinct the way gunfighting does. Faster than thought, aimed before the other party knows they are in the sights. He said, "Mr. Cole, I owe you an apology." He extended his hand. I shook it, because not shaking it tells a man too much about what you know before you are ready to show it. He said the misunderstanding with the daughters was entirely the result of a clerical error at a difficult time in the family. He said he hoped the marriage had been a satisfactory arrangement despite the confusion of its beginning. He said he was here simply to ensure that the original contract was honored in its spirit, if not its letter, and that he wished only the best for his daughter and her new husband. He said all of this with the smoothness of water moving over stone. I waited until he finished. Then I said, "Marshal Briggs is waiting for us at Pastor Mercer's office. I believe you know why." The smoothness did not disappear, but something beneath it shifted, the way a good plaster wall shifts before it cracks, imperceptibly at first, and then suddenly visible along every fault line. He said, "I am not sure I understand." I said, "You will when you read the documents." At Pastor Mercer's office, with Marshal Briggs present and Walt standing by the door, I put Vivien's financial records on the table, then the Malone letters, then the land documents. Harlan Ashfield looked at the financial records for a long time. He said, "These were obtained without authorization." Briggs said, "They were provided voluntarily by a party with access to them. That is a different matter." And he said, "My daughter." Briggs said, "Your daughter is not currently under investigation, Mr. Ashfield. You are." The charm was still present, but it was working harder now, visibly working, the machinery showing through the polish. He tried two more approaches: a procedural argument about the mortgage instrument, an emotional appeal about family and misunderstanding, and then he stopped, because he had looked at the documents long enough to understand that what was in them was sufficient. Marshal Briggs said, "I have a warrant, Mr. Ashfield, for fraud in connection with the land debt instrument and conspiracy in connection with the actions of one Rex Malone, formerly a deputy in this county. You will accompany me to Austin." Harlan Ashfield looked across the table at me. For just a moment, underneath all the polish and calculation, I saw what was there: a man who had spent his whole life treating people as instruments, and had arrived at a moment where every instrument had turned. Then he looked at the door. Nora was standing in it. He asked to speak to her privately. I looked at Nora. She nodded once. I moved out of the doorway and she went in. I waited outside on the church steps with Walt in the cold January air. Through the wall, I could hear voices, but not words. The conversation lasted about 4 minutes. Then it was quiet. Nora came out. Her face was very still in the way it went when she was processing something she had not decided how to feel about yet. I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "He told me he sent me here for my own good, that he had always known I was stronger than Vivien, better suited to the practical life, that placing me here was a kind of faith in me." I waited. She said, "I think he believes that. I think when he looks back at the decision, he has found a version of it that is kind." She paused. "That is the saddest part. Not that he is lying. That he has told it to himself long enough that he cannot find the other version anymore." I said, "Do you believe him?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe he is my father, and I will not see him again, and I said what I needed to say to him, and now that part is done." It was not forgiveness. It was something more practical than forgiveness, and possibly more durable. The clean close of an account that had been carried too long. Marshal Briggs took Harlan Ashfield to Austin that afternoon. His 2 men left without being asked. Vivien had not come to Redemption Creek for the final proceeding. She sent a note that arrived the day before, brief and unsigned in the particular way of someone who is not yet sure what name to put to herself. It said, "Tell Nora I am in San Antonio. I found work. I am learning to be bad at something new. V." I gave it to Nora at breakfast. She read it and put it in the pocket of her apron. She said, "Good." That was all she said. But the way she said it, quietly, with something that was not quite relief and not quite warmth, but somewhere between the two, told me that the door she had left open for her sister was still open. Not wide, not unconditional, but open. Walt came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and sat down at the table and said, "Marshall's gone, then?" I said, "Yes." Walt said, "Good." He drank his coffee. "Fence on the east line needs attention before the next cold front." Nora said, "I mapped the weak sections last week. The post at the creek crossing is the priority." Walt looked at her. Then he looked at me. Then he went back to his coffee. That was the whole morning. Outside, the hill country was cold and clear and going about its business. Spring came to the hill country the way it always does, slowly at first and then all at once. The bluebonnets appearing on the limestone slopes between one morning and the next. The creek running clear and quick with snowmelt from the higher country to the north. The air losing its bite and replacing it with something that smelled like cedar and new grass and possibility. Coles Ridge in April was a different place than it had been in October. Not because the land had changed, because the people in it had. Walt taught Nora to read the sky. Not in a formal way, not sitting down with instruction. The way he taught things, which was by doing them in front of someone and trusting them to observe. She followed him on the morning rounds, and he pointed at things without always explaining them. And she asked questions when she had them and stayed quiet when she did not. And over the course of the winter, she had learned the things he knew about this particular piece of Texas sky. Which cloud formation meant a norther was building, what color the sunset needed to be to promise a clear tomorrow, how the behavior of the cattle changed 6 hours before a hard rain. He had never taught anyone these things before. I knew that. They both knew it without saying it. One morning I came out to find them standing at the fence, looking at the northern horizon. Nora, with her coffee, and Walt, with his hat pushed back. Both of them reading the same sky in companionable silence. I left them to it. The spring cattle count happened in the first week of April, with 2 new hands we had hired in February. Goodman Walt had vetted personally, which was the only vetting that mattered at Coles Ridge. Nora tallied the herd with the count sheets she had designed over the winter, a system that tracked not just numbers but weights and conditions, and projected outcomes through summer and fall. She presented the count to me in front of the assembled crew, which had become the natural shape of how information moved on the ranch. Nobody found this unusual. It had simply become the way things were done. The new hands had never known anything different. To them, Coles Ridge was a ranch with two people running it who happened to be married. That was the whole picture. No history of arrangement or doubt or replacement was visible in the present tense of the thing. I thought about that, about how what people see in the present does not always know about the past that made it. A letter arrived from San Antonio in the third week of April. Nora read it at the kitchen table. When she finished, she set it down and looked at it for a moment. I said, "Vivien." She said, "She is working as a bookkeeper for a law office. She says she is terrible at it and getting better. She says San Antonio in spring is better than she expected." Nora paused. "She asks if she might visit sometime, when she is less terrible at her job." I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think yes, not soon, but yes." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. "She is figuring out what she is without him arranging it. That takes time." I said, "You know what that is like." She looked at me, a small, quiet look. "I do." In the early evening of a Friday in late April, I took Nora to the limestone rise above the east pasture. It was the highest point on Coles Ridge, a shelf of pale rock that jutted out over the slope, looking east and south across the full spread of the property. The last light came at a low angle and turned everything gold, the way Texas light does in spring when it is moving toward the horizon and the air is clean. We had not been here together before. I had been here alone many times, usually when I needed to think, usually when the ranch felt like a weight rather than a home. I had stood here in drought years and asked the land what it needed and gotten no answer except more work. I had stood here the night after Ellen left and felt the particular desolation of a man who has lost something he is not certain he should have had in the first place. I had not brought anyone here before. Nora stood at the edge of the rock shelf and looked at the land below us. The corrals, the barn, the house with smoke from the kitchen chimney, the new green on the south pasture, the creek glinting where it bent through the low ground. I said, "I want to tell you something." She turned and looked at me. I said, "I have been trying to find the right way to say it for about 2 months, and I have decided that there is not a right way, there is only the saying of it, so I am going to do that." She waited. No assistance. She knew me well enough by now to know that I needed to find it myself. I said, 6 months ago, I was keeping this ranch going out of stubbornness. Not love for it, just stubbornness. I did not want to be the man who lost the thing he built. There was no joy in it. Just the work, day after day. And the work was fine. But fine is not a life. Fine is just continuing. I looked at the land below us. I said, "You changed that, not by doing anything large, by being here, by caring whether the heifer in the north pasture made it through the night, by getting $12 more from Beaumont than I would have accepted, by sitting on the porch steps and saying you did not want to take up too much space." I looked at her. I said, "I love you, Nora, not because you saved this ranch, although you did. Not because you are useful, although Lord knows. Because when I look at this place now, I see it the way it is supposed to be seen. As a life that is being lived in it, not a sentence, not a test, a life. You are the reason I see it that way." The last light moved across the limestone slope below us. I said, "I am not easy. I went 3 years lying to a whole town about a wife who was not dead. I am better with horses than with words. I will get things wrong in ways I cannot currently anticipate. But I am going to choose you every day for the rest of my life, and I am going to get better at saying so." She looked at me for a long moment, or a tugged. The hill country was quiet around us. A hawk turned in the updraft above the south ridge. From the barn below, the sound of horses shifting in their stalls. She said, "I got on that wagon because I did not have anywhere better to go. I want you to know that clearly. That is the true beginning." She took a step toward me. She said, "I stayed because of you. Because you told me about Ellen when you did not have to. Because you stood beside me instead of in front of me with the cattle buyer. Because you sat with me in the barn at dawn after the calving and did not say a single unnecessary word, and it was the most comfortable silence I had ever been in. She was close now. Her voice was steady and direct the way it always was, the way it had been on the train platform the first morning, the way I had recognized even then as something worth paying attention to. She said, "I love you, Garrett Cole, including the part where you are better with horses than conversation." "I will take the horses," I laughed. Not the controlled, almost laugh that was the most I had managed in 3 years. The real kind, the kind that surprises you when it arrives, that comes from somewhere below calculation. She was smiling. Not performing a smile, wearing one. The kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. I put my arms around her and she put her head against my chest, and we stood on the limestone rise above Cole's Ridge, while the last of the April light left the sky, and the first stars appeared over the hill country, hard and brilliant the way Texas stars are, factual, enormous, indifferent to everything except the truth of their own brightness. The next morning I woke before first light the way I always have. I lay still for a moment listening to the sounds of the ranch coming awake. Horses shifting, the distant low of a cow, the wind in the junipers on the east ridge. Sounds I had been listening to alone for 9 years. The same sounds with one difference, which was that the other side of the bed was not empty. I got up quietly, put the coffee on, went out to the porch. The hill country was doing what it does at first light, moving from black to gray to the pale gold that belongs exclusively to Texas mornings, the color that has no name in the language of other places. The bluebonnets on the slope below the house caught it first, going from invisible to vivid in the space of 10 minutes. I stood there with my coffee in the morning and did not think about anything in particular. That was new. The particular absence of the anxious accounting that had been the background noise of my mornings for 3 years. The tallying of debts and deficits and things that might go wrong. The morning was just a morning. The screen door opened behind me. Nora came out with her own cup, hair down, my old coat thrown over her shoulders because the April mornings still had cold in them. She stood beside me and looked at the bluebonnets on the slope and drank her coffee. She did not say good morning. I did not say it either. We had learned each other's mornings well enough to know that some of them belong to the quiet and the light, and speech in them is not an addition but a subtraction. From the direction of the barn, Walt's voice came clear on the still air. He shouted, "The bay mare foaled. Come see. She is a good one." Nora turned her head and looked at me. I looked at her. We set our cups on the porch railing. We went. Behind us the coffee cooled in the cups, and the morning light moved across Cole's Ridge the way it always had and always would, indifferent to everything except what was actually there. The barn, the corrals, the limestone house with 2 cups on the porch railing, the bluebonnets on the east slope, the hawk already up on the first thermals, and 2 people walking through the spring morning toward the sound of something new being born on land they had built together, choosing each other with every step in the ordinary and complete way of people who have stopped being afraid of what they might find at the end of a choice made plain. That is all it was. That is everything it was. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
This story is much more than a Western romance. At its heart, it is a story about truth, courage, redemption, and the slow building of trust between 2 wounded people. Set against the harsh yet beautiful landscape of the Texas hill country, the story shows us that real strength is not always loud, and real love is not born from appearance, convenience, or performance. It is built through honesty, endurance, and shared labor. One of the clearest meanings of the story is that appearances can be deceptive, but character reveals itself over time. Garrett expects one woman and meets another. At first, Nora is a disappointment, only because she does not match the photograph or the plan. But the story carefully teaches us that a person's worth is never contained in outward beauty or first expectations. Nora proves herself not through words, but through action, by bringing order to the household, by helping with the animals, by understanding the land, and by standing firm in moments of danger. In the world of the story, true value is measured not by how someone looks, but by what they do when life becomes difficult. That is a powerful lesson for all of us. Too often, people judge by surfaces. This story reminds us to judge by integrity, loyalty, and quiet competence. Another important meaning of the story is that honesty is painful, but it is the beginning of freedom. Garrett has been living inside a lie about his first marriage. Nora has been carrying the truth about her family's scheme and her own escape. Both of them are burdened by the past. Yet the moment their relationship begins to deepen is the moment they stop hiding. Garrett tells the truth about Ellen. Nora tells the truth about why she came. These confessions are not romantic decorations. They are acts of courage. The story suggests that no lasting relationship, whether love, friendship, or community, can be built on falsehood. Truth may cost comfort in the short term, but lies cost peace in the long term. That is one of the deepest moral lessons in the story. Truth is not always easy, but it is always cleaner than deception. The story also teaches us that love is a choice made in ordinary days. This is perhaps the most beautiful moral lesson of all. Garrett and Nora do not fall in love through grand speeches at the beginning. They come to love each other through work, shared silence, mutual respect, and steady presence. They save calves, repair roofs, manage ledgers, survive threats, and face danger together. Their love is not built on fantasy. It is built on daily faithfulness. This gives the story a mature and meaningful view of love. It tells us that real love is not simply passion. Real love is partnership. It is standing beside someone instead of in front of them. It is seeing their strengths clearly and honoring them. It is choosing them again and again, especially when life is hard. There is also a strong moral lesson about dignity and self-worth. Nora leaves a life in which she has been tolerated, rather than cherished. She steps into the unknown, not because she is fearless, but because remaining where she was would have destroyed her spirit. Her journey teaches that there comes a time when a person must walk away from manipulation, control, and emotional imprisonment. The story honors the courage it takes to leave what is familiar in order to find what is right. In the same way, Garrett must reclaim his own dignity by facing the truth about his past and refusing to remain the man shame made him become. Both characters are redeemed, not by luck, but by moral choice. They become better because they choose honesty over fear and courage over silence. Finally, the story tells us that healing does not come all at once. It comes the way spring comes in the hill country, slowly, then suddenly. Trust is earned. Wounds close over time. Home is not simply a place. It is something built between people who choose to